Award-winning author and reporter Robert Whitaker continues his work on mental illness and the pharmaceutical industry in Anatomy of an Epidemic. His new book looks at the long-term use of psychiatric drugs to treat mental illness. His research suggests that drugs are more disabling than helpful. He talks about it at the National Arts Program in New York City. This is an hour and a half.
I have to say it is an extraordinary honor to be here today. And the reason it's such an extraordinary honor is because Community Access has really been delivering on a promise that we made 50 years ago. So if you go back to basically when we as a society decided to say we're going to close our state mental hospitals and we're going to move care into the community, a promise was made. And the promise was decent housing and really help people live full lives. And Community Access has now been doing this, I think, since 1972. Is that correct? And that's why it's such an honor to be here, because you are delivering on that promise. So God bless all of you, and you should be proud. It's a great organization. The book, I am going to talk about this book, and the book does have a sort of big sense to it. And to put it in perspective is this, is that even going back to that time when Thorazine enters asylum medicine in 1955, we've had a certain paradigm of care, where increasingly medications have been at the heart of that care, sort of drug-based care. And what this book really does is look at whether that paradigm of care, where medications are sort of central, how is it working for us as a society? And of course that means how is it working for individuals as well? And as I look at that question, it may be that maybe we could think of a paradigm of care that was slightly different, or maybe even radically different. And the question is, if the evidence that we have now of 50 years following this path, is it going to tell us that it's working well or not? And that's really part of what this book is about. It's a very fundamental question that I'm asking here. Now, the common understanding in our society, and it's, by the way, it's one I certainly shared 10 years ago at the start of this whole adventure, was that, of course, it's working. The understanding is that when Thorazine arrived in asylum medicine in 1955, that kicked off a psychopharmacological revolution. You can read in some history books that the arrival of Thorazine is as important as penicillin was in internal medicine. An extraordinary leap forward. The common understanding is that thanks to these medications, it made it possible to empty the state mental hospitals and for people to live in the community. And then, of course, we've heard the story that in fact these drugs, even if we look at the names, they're antipsychotic, meaning they're sort of specific antidotes, antidepressants, specific antidotes. And of course, there's a belief that they fix chemical imbalances in the brain, and if that's true, that indeed is a great advance, because you've identified a pathology and now you have a treatment for it. And as part of this understanding, and we sort of believe this revolution in care took place in two steps. We had the first generation of drugs, from that's Thorazine, the tricyclic antidepressants, etc. And then in 1987, Prozac came to market. This was the first of the second generation drugs. And these drugs are said to be, the second generation, even another step forward, more safer and more efficacious than the first generation. So the story we believe in is really a story of medical progress. And if you would have read David Satcher, he was the U.S. Surgeon General in 1998, I think his report was, his mental health report. He sort of told this story. And he said, back in before 1955, psychiatry lacked treatments that could prevent people from becoming chronically ill. Now we have these treatments that in fact help people lead relatively normal lives. Okay? And we said we have safe and effective treatments for a vast array of nicely defined disorders. So that's the story of medical progress we believe in. And again, I would like to say, in 1998, I co-wrote a series for the Boston Globe, and it was on the abuse of psychiatric patients in research. And one of the premises of that series was looking at studies where they had withdrawn antipsychotics from schizophrenia patients. And we were saying that is incredibly unethical and abusive, because you would never withdraw insulin from a diabetic, so why would you withdraw antipsychotic medication from a person with schizophrenia? So that's my starting point for this long intellectual sort of journey I've been on that is going to arrive, frankly, at a very different place in this book. But I want you to know I began there. Now, what's the puzzle that is at the heart of this book that sort of sets off this journey? It's this puzzle. The first thing I did in this book was just look at the number of people under government care, which is sometimes called the, people with the disabled mentally ill is sometimes labeled, but let's just say people under government care due to a mental illness. Now, if you go back to 1955, there were roughly 560,000 people in the state mental hospitals. If you dig into that number a bit, though, there's actually only about 360,000 people with psychiatric diagnoses. There's about 200,000 Alzheimer's, people with alcohol-related problems, in-stage syphilis, etc. So 360,000 at the beginning of this revolution, okay? Now, of course, we switched to community care, and the way researchers have tracked the number of, quote, disabled mentally ill is looking at the number of people on SSI and SSDI due to mental illness. And you can see that's sort of why they do that. Now, in 1987, that number had grown to 1.2 million. That's an increase. Now, since 1987, when we got the second-generation drugs, and we really embraced this form of care, the number of people on SSI and SSDI has tripled to 4 million. It is now increasing at the rate of 850 people per day, 365 days a year going on SSI and SSDI due to a disability, because they've been disabled by a mental illness. So you can see the paradox here right away, right? As this revolution has unfolded, the one we say that prevents chronicity, we're actually seeing numbers that tell of an epidemic of chronicity. So the question is that I'm looking at is, why is that so? At the very least, it begs the question of whether this revolution really has played out like we might hope it to play out. And by the way, one other bit of data. In 1987, there were 16,200 children receiving SSI due to a mental illness disability. That's when we began medicating children. Today, there's 600,000. 35-fold increase. There's 250 children going on SSI every day now in the United States. And if you follow them forward, when they hit 18, they're going right on adult SSI, SSDI. So you can really see this pathway that's forming in our society where kids get diagnosed, and next thing you know, they've got a career as a mental patient laid out in front of them. So here's really the puzzle, I think. We have this story of that there's been this psychopharmacological revolution that greatly improved outcomes. And there's other thing I think we have to acknowledge. Yes, can drugs help people through? We know this to be true. We know that drugs often do help people in times of crisis. We see that. We also know people who've stabilized well on medications too. We see that. We know that. But yet, in a big picture way, we have this other problem of increasing chronicity, increasing disability numbers. And so it really raises this question. Could our drug-centered form of care, for some unforeseen paradoxical reason, be actually fueling this rise in the number of disabled mentally ill? Okay, I think you can see it's a legitimate question. And then when you ask that question, what you're really going to want to see, and you're going to want to see what science can tell us, is how does this paradigm of care, how do medications alter the long-term course of mental disorders? So how do they alter the long-term course of schizophrenia, of bipolar disorder, depression, anxiety, etc.? Do they alter it for the better? Do you see employment rates go up? Do you see symptoms, are they less symptomatic, more symptomatic, that sort of thing? Do you see cognitive function improving in the modern age or deteriorating? Those are the sort of questions you want to ask. That's the first question we're going to see if we can find in the scientific literature. And I think you see it, this is an evidence-based approach, all right? And the second question is this. Another possible problem is, let's say, do we have a form of care where you take someone who has say a mild problem, say they come in with a mild bout of depression, Okay, that's their entry moment. And they're put on, let's say, an antidepressant, and a certain percentage of people may have a manic episode in response to that antidepressant. At that point, they may be diagnosed with bipolar, and now they're into a much more serious category. So one of the things may be happening, this is a possibility, is that we're taking people with milder problems at the beginning, and at least some people are getting pushed into a much more serious category. And as you know, if you end up in the bipolar category today, you often end up on a cocktail, and that is really a serious shove into seriousness, as what one person told me. So that's another possibility we want to look at. And I want to say one disclaimer now about this book, because it can be misunderstood so big time. It's not a medical advice book. That's number one, okay? It really is trying to investigate this puzzle and this problem that I think we do need to investigate, because we just don't want these numbers to continue. And by the way, if they keep on continuing, we're going to run out of money anyway. So something we have to try to stem this epidemic, so to speak. So it's a big picture question. That's number one. And the hope here is, let's say we do find that there's a problem with medications long term. It doesn't mean that you're going to say that the medications have to be thrown out. But maybe the evidence base is going to tell us that we have to think of the medications in a different way and use them in a different manner. Okay? Does that make sense? So I hope that's the approach. I think it may get lost in the book a bit, but that was my thought. And if you look at this, you'll see that it's actually there. And when you go to the solutions, you'll see it there as well. Okay, one of the first things I think as you approach this question, you really do have to see, what do the drugs do, and what do we know about the causes of mental illness? In other words, we really have to ask ourselves, do the drugs fix a chemical imbalance? All right? And the reason we have to ask that, because good medicine arises from clarity about what the drugs do. Okay? And if you're deluding yourself, that can be a problem. And real quickly on the chemical imbalance story, where it arose and what they investigated and what they found. The chemical imbalance story arises in the 1960s, and it arises out of an understanding of investigations into how the drugs act on the brain. They start to learn. So, for example, they understand that antipsychotics block dopaminergic activity. All right? So they hypothesize that people with schizophrenia have too much dopamine. Okay? But they haven't found that. It's a hypothesis, and the reason they make that hypothesis partly is to put it into a magic bullet framework, okay, that the drugs are fixing something that's wrong. With the antidepressants, the same thing. They found that it acted on certain neurotransmitters in the brain, and eventually that settled around the idea, okay, antidepressants sort of keep serotonin in the synaptic cleft longer than normal, so it enhances serotonin, so people with depression have low serotonin. That's a hypothesis. Okay, now that hypothesis, if I can find my water. Anyway, that's okay. Right behind me. Thank you. Sorry. They investigated that hypothesis in the 1970s, and here's how they investigated it. And let's just focus on the low serotonin theory, because that's the one we've heard so much about. So this is a little bit of science. Remember how neurons communicate in the brain, right? Sorry.
I was asked.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me now? Is that better? Okay. How do neurons communicate in the brain? Remember, the presynaptic neuron releases serotonin into the synaptic cleft, right? And that neurotransmitter then binds with receptors on the postsynaptic neuron. Okay, that signal then has to be terminated, and the way it's terminated, that serotonin has to be removed from the synaptic cleft. It's removed in one of two ways. It's either taken back up into the presynaptic neuron, or it's metabolized by an enzyme. And those metabolites show up in the cerebrospinal fluid. So researchers said, aha, we can look for that metabolite in samples of the cerebrospinal fluid, and if people with depression have low serotonin, then they should have low numbers of metabolites in the cerebrospinal fluid, okay? You see the reasoning on that? So they make those measurements in the 1970s, and here's what they found. They found that people with depression had a variability in terms of the amount of metabolites in their cerebrospinal fluid. It was like a bell curve. Like any bell curve, you have a group in the lower end, 50% in the middle, and 25% on the upper end. Okay, there's a variability. Then they did it in, quote, normals, not depressed people. The bell curve was the same. Okay, there was no difference between those bell curves. Then a person from Sweden said, okay, but I did this study, and that low end of the bell curve with my depressed patients, I had more suicidality. So really what happened, then the idea came, oh, well, maybe there's a subset of people with depression that, quote, have low serotonin. All right? That's how this survived for a bit. So then researchers said, okay, if that's true, it's that people, that subset, that should respond best to a drug that selectively blocks the reuptake of serotonin. So now they're putting this, does the drug fix a chemical imbalance, at least in this subset of people, to test. And the NIMH did that in the early 1980s, and they found there was no correlation. So the people with the high levels of metabolites, they were just as likely to respond to the drug as those with the low levels. And so here's what the NIMH concluded in 1983. Elevations or decrements in the functioning of serotonergic systems per se are not likely to be associated with depression. So we've been told all these years that people with depression have low serotonin. It actually fell apart in 1983, right from the beginning. And there have been other, the schizophrenia hypothesis, the high dopamine hypothesis was tested the same way. None of them ever panned out. And so in fact, in 2005, Kenneth Kendler, co-editor-in-chief of Psychological Medicine, summed up this history. He says, we have hunted for big, simple neurochemical explanations for psychiatric disorders, and we have not found them. Okay? So in other words, one of the problems here is we still don't know what the biology is underlying mental disorders. It's still unknown. So they don't, that's the first thing. Then the second question we have to ask, then what do the drugs do? How do they act on the brain? That's the obvious second question. And let's go back to Prozac, because that's where we really came to believe that they fixed this low serotonin. Well, they fleshed out how Prozac acts on the brain really in the 1970s and early 80s. So what does Prozac do? Let's go back. Remember, the presynaptic neuron is putting serotonin into the synaptic cleft, right? And then to terminate that message, it has to be removed. A lot of it goes back into the presynaptic neuron via reuptake channels. Prozac blocks those channels, okay? And serotonin stays longer in the synaptic cleft, and the idea is that enhances serotonergic transmission, okay? Because it's around now to keep on binding with the receptor. But here's the problem. And actually, I think this is part of the problem why long-term outcomes are so problematic with this form of care. The brain immediately says, uh-oh, this is not good. It has feedback loops. And the brain says, because it actually wants to maintain normal functioning. So think of the drug as an accelerator on serotonergic activity. What does the brain do? It immediately goes through adaptations to put the brake on serotonergic activity. And it does it in two ways. The presynaptic neuron starts putting out less serotonin, and the postsynaptic neuron will actually pare away its receptors. It'll become desensitized to serotonin, and you'll actually end up with an abnormally low level of serotonergic receptors. So here's the metaphor, the paradigm, and the problem. And basically they found that with all the drugs, okay? If a drug tries to block transmission, the brain will respond by putting down the accelerator. It's trying to compensate for this interruption of its normal function. And in 1996, Stephen Hyman, who was then head of the NIMH, he's a neuroscientist, today he's a provost at Harvard University, he summed up what 30 years of research showed about how psychiatric medications affect the brain. First thing is, he says, people do not have any characteristic chemical imbalance, okay? That's a myth used to sell drugs, basically. It's a myth that ends up believed, but it's a myth. He says, here's what happens. The drugs perturb neurotransmitter systems in the brain, and in response to that perturbation, the brain undergoes compensatory adaptations of the type we just talked about. And he says at the end of that adaptive process, the brain is operating, and I quote, in a manner that is both qualitatively and quantitatively different than normal. So once you understand drugs in that sort of scientific way, and we get away from sort of the sense of the chemical imbalance story that makes us think that they're like antibiotics, etc., at the very least you see this. You see that why this might be problematic over the long term, because it's not they're not a normalizing drug. In fact, they're creating this abnormality. And as we go forward here, you're going to see why going off the drugs becomes so problematic. And once you get the accelerator brake thing, you can see it in a second. Okay, that's just a conception. And in the book, that's in like the, I don't know, pages 30 to 50 or 30 to 70, and people tell me, boy, that's a little slow going, Bob. If I can just get through that part, then maybe the book will be interesting. But anyway, slog through that. You're not the only one. That's what my friends are telling me. It's hard. It's tough. There you go. But the problem is it sets up the understanding, okay? Now, what I do in the book after that, the question then arises, how does this form of care, how do medications affect the long-term course of disorders? And basically, I try to put together a long-term story for schizophrenia, anxiety, depression, and bipolar illness in adults. And then I do the same for kids, just looking, what's happening to kids who are medicated, and how are they faring 5, 6 years later, etc. And I thought maybe what I would do, I'll go through the schizophrenia story a bit more in depth, and then we'll quickly hit on some of the others, okay? And we'll see if some common patterns emerge. But the reason I thought I'd pick this schizophrenia study is for 2 reasons. If there's any class of drugs that should show a clear benefit over the long term, it's antipsychotics. First of all, antipsychotics are at the core of the story we believe. They're the drugs that we believe allowed us to empty the asylums, right? That's number one. Number two, in terms of our social policy is geared up to make sure people stay on these medications. Oftentimes, in essence, they come with court orders or outpatient orders, etc. If you're a psychiatrist and you do not treat someone with an antipsychotic, it's almost considered unethical, practically illegal in some places. So if there's any class of drugs, as we go through the long-term outcomes data, that should have a clear beneficial profile, it's this class of drugs. All right? Real quickly, in terms to do this, the first thing you have to do to flesh out the long-term, how it's altering perhaps the long-term course, is you have to go back to the pre-drug era and just look what was happening to people. What were epidemiological studies showing prior to when we medicated and started changing the course with medication? And now, schizophrenia is a confusing story, but what I did is I looked, what were the outcomes of newly diagnosed schizophrenia patients from 1945 to 1955? Now, our belief, of course, is that people just were all chronically ill. They couldn't live out of the hospital, right? Here's what you'll find. For example, there was a big study at Warren State Hospital. They found that 62% of their newly diagnosed schizophrenia patients were discharged within 12 months. And at the end of 3 years, 73% were living successfully in the community. Okay, that's in the late 1940s. And they're not on disability, obviously, because there's no disability program at that time to sustain them. Another large study at Delaware State Hospital found that of first episode schizophrenia patients, that 85% were discharged within 5 years. And in this group, 70% were successfully living in the community at the end of 6 years. So this idea that all first episode schizophrenia patients ended up chronic and couldn't live out of the hospital, that's not true. In England, by the way, they also did at this time another long-term study of about 5 years. England was diagnosing schizophrenia much more narrowly at the time, so it was a sicker population. Even so, at the end of 5 years, 1/3 were completely recovered. Another 20% were socially recovered, which meant they were able to work. In other words, the unemployment rate was over 50%. Okay, real quickly. I know you were surprised by this, but that's what you'll find if you look in the data from 45 to 55. It's not this everybody becomes chronically ill. Real quickly, did the drugs empty the asylums? There's 2 questions on that. First of all, you have to look at the discharge rates for the newly diagnosed patients. California did a big study in 1958, and here's what they found. Of all their newly diagnosed schizophrenia patients for 2 years, it was over 1,000 patients. Those not treated with medications, 88% were discharged within 18 months. Those treated with medication, 74% were discharged. So that's not a story that says you're accelerating the discharge of newly diagnosed patients. The other question is, does it release the chronic patients? And you can see in these numbers you are going to get some chronic patients. Not everybody is living in the community well. The population in 1955 was roughly 267,000 schizophrenia patients in state mental hospitals. 8 years later, it had declined to 253,000. It hadn't really changed. The release of patients was a social policy, really. It's when basically the federal government said to the states, if you release patients and start caring for them in the community, we'll pay for half the money. So that's really when you get the deinstitutionalization. So you see a bit of the myth there. Real quickly on the evidence base for antipsychotics, it's two parts. One, if you take a newly psychotic patients and you randomize half drug, half placebo, and you follow them for 6 weeks, sure enough, the target symptom of psychosis abates more in the drug-treated patients. Okay? It works. That's why they get FDA approval. And actually, I'd say that's a pretty profound advantage sometimes. Okay? Now, the second part of the evidence base is this. Once they have patients on medication, the question is how long should they maintain them on medication? So they ran studies that worked like this. They would take good responders to medication, and they would abruptly withdraw the drug from one half, and then the other half would be maintained, and regularly those abruptly withdrawn relapsed at a much higher rate. And so they said to themselves, aha, that's the disease coming back, all right, and therefore we need to keep people on medications to prevent the disease coming back. And that's the rationale for maintaining people long-term on the meds, all right? And if you go to the JAMA, that's still cited, it's two parts. But in 2005, Emmanuel Stipp, who's a psychiatrist from the University of Montreal, went over this evidence base. It was for the 50th anniversary of antipsychotics. And he says, well, we have a problem with this evidence base. There's nothing in there that says we're increasing employment rates. There's nothing in there that says we're increasing functionality rates. And there's nothing that says, let's go back and let's start with 100 patients first episode, and let's put 50 on meds, and 50, let's not expose them to meds. There's nothing that tells us that we're actually improving the long-term course in that compared to that non-exposed group. So he said in 1955 this: after 50 years of neuroleptics, meaning antipsychotics, can we answer the following simple question? Are neuroleptics effective in treating schizophrenia? There was, he said, no compelling evidence on the matter when long-term is considered. Now, I say this because it's almost like by making this investigation, I'm doing something heretical, okay? But here's a mainstream guy saying, we really don't have evidence we're improving the long-term. And then he said something that really, I think, goes to the heart of this book. He says, if we wish to base psychiatry on evidence-based medicine, we run a genuine risk in taking a closer look at what has long been considered fact. And that's really what I'm doing in that book, okay? And by the way, the evidence I'm going to review now real quickly on long-term is their evidence, mainstream stuff. Okay, long-term, really quickly. The very first long-term study is done in the 1960s, and it actually arises out of the very first well-controlled short-term study. It was done by the NIMH. It had 4 arms. 3 groups got drug, 3 different types of antipsychotics, 1 placebo, okay? After 6 weeks, the drug-treated patients, no question, are doing better. This was actually the trial that launched the whole sense that these are not tranquilizers, they're antipsychotics. But then a year later, they come back and look which group has higher rehospitalization rates, and they're startled. It's the drug-treated patients. And so right at this beginning moment in the long-term outcomes literature, we see the hint of a paradox. Drugs that may be effective over the short term for some reason may be increasing the chronicity of the disorder over the long term. It's just a hint. They didn't control for medication in that year-long follow-up. Then if you look at the data at the time in the 60s and the observation people would make, they said, wow, you know, we're getting people coming back to the hospital in droves, and they called this the revolving door syndrome. Why are they all coming back so regularly now? And you also see people making observation, it seems our drug-treated patients are having more severe relapses than before. That once they're on drug, it seems like they're just, now they jump back into a deeper psychosis. So there's this concern that arises, right? And, excuse me. So because of this concern, they run 3 studies, the NIMH does in the 1970s, that is meant to address this question. Do we have a chronicity problem? And the design in these 3 studies is not really a no drug versus drug. It's a selective drug versus drug. And by that I mean this. They take first episode patients, and in the experimental arm of these, they do not immediately put everybody on a neuroleptic, okay? Because they want to see if some people can get better without being put on an antipsychotic. And then if after 4, 5, 6 weeks people aren't getting better, they will put them on, okay? So they're just using it as a fallback. It's not a no med, it's a selective med. The first one was done by a guy named Maurice Rappaport out at the University of California in San Francisco on his experimental side. And by the way, the experimental people side, they're also getting good psychosocial care. It's not just placebo. They're trying to do things to help people through the psychosis. Community care, social care, being with people, etc. So not just placebo. It's sort of what's the possibility with psychosocial care. Anyway, Maurice Rappaport at the University of California, he had 41 in his experimental arm. Here were the results. Overall, the experimental patients did better, his group, than in the standard form of care where everybody was immediately put on neuroleptics. That's number 1. Number 2, 24 of his 41 schizophrenia patients at the end of 3 years had never been exposed to a single dose of medication. So 24 of 41, more than half, were able to get better without being put on the drug. Third thing is, it was that group that got better, the psychosis abated, that had by far the best 3-year outcomes. And so what you start to see in his is sort of an escape valve that can happen with first episode patients. And here's what he wrote. He wrote, "Our findings suggest that antipsychotic medication is not the treatment of choice, at least for certain patients, if one is interested in long-term clinical improvements. Many unmedicated while in hospital patients showed greater long-term improvements, less pathology at follow-up, fewer rehospitalizations, and better overall functioning in the community than patients who were given chlorpromazine, that's Thorazine, while in the hospital." Okay? Major study finding that if you're interested in long-term, there's apparently a group that can escape and do better. The second study was done by Lauren Mosher. He was head of schizophrenia studies at NIMH at the time. He opened a home in California called Soteria Place. Soteria was a place where newly diagnosed schizophrenia patients would be in a home staffed by people who had an empathy and a tolerance and actually liked being with people that might be in very psychotic distress states. Okay? And here were his results. At the end of 2 years, his experimental group, compared to those treated conventionally with antipsychotics right from the beginning, had, quote, lower psychopathology scores, fewer readmissions, and better global adjustments. So again, we saw that this selective form of care produced better outcomes. In terms of medication use, he had 42% of his patients at the end of 2 years had never been exposed to antipsychotics. 39% had been exposed on a temporary basis. Only 19% regularly remained on antipsychotics. That was the second study. Third study was done in-house at the NIMH. Again, it was done by William Carpenter, who is one of the well-known figures in the field. Again, the experimental arm had, on the whole, better outcomes, those not treated with medication. And one of the interesting things about this study is they interviewed the people afterwards. And that was a 1-year study. That wasn't as long as the other one. And they interviewed, what was it like? Fortunately, that wasn't the water. What was it like to go through these psychotic episodes without drugs? And the patients said this. They said it was disturbing. It was painful. But it was also gratifying and informative. And what Carpenter concluded, Carpenter and Tom McGlashan concluded, is that the people on medication didn't have the chance to go through this learning process while they were numbed by drugs, and they said as a result they seemed less able to cope with life stresses afterwards. Okay, that was their perception at that time. And then Carpenter raised a really profound, troubling question. And this is a moment where you see this whole psychopharmacology revolution sort of saying, uh-oh, have we gone off the rails? He says, there is no question that once patients are placed on medication, they are less vulnerable to relapse if maintained on neuroleptics. But what if these patients had never been treated with drugs to begin with? We raised the possibility that antipsychotic medication may make some schizophrenic patients more vulnerable to future relapse than would be the case in the natural course of illness. And you see the uh-oh moment here. We're talking about the target symptom of psychosis, right? And if the drugs actually make them more biologically vulnerable to psychosis, we're sort of losing the benefit over here, because drugs are supposed to, we know they have risk, but the whole point of antipsychotics is to reduce the problems with psychosis. And if somehow the drug is making people more biologically vulnerable over time, that's a real problem. Now, at this point, two guys from McGill University in Montreal came forth with a biological explanation for what was going on. Why were you seeing higher relapse rates in the drug-treated groups as a whole? And they said, basically, we've got two problems going on. So how do antipsychotics work? They block dopamine. They block 70 to 90% of a certain type of dopamine receptor called the D2 receptor. All right? That profoundly blocks dopamine transmission. The brain that puts a brake on it. The brain immediately says, uh-oh, I got to put down the accelerator. It puts down the accelerator in two ways. The presynaptic neurons put out more dopamine, and the postsynaptic neurons increase the density of the receptors. They become super sensitive to dopamine. And what these two McGill University guys said is, the brain has now become sort of super sensitive to dopamine, he said, and this is what makes them more biologically vulnerable to psychosis. You're actually changing in that way. Now he says, watch what happens. Why is withdrawal? Why do we get such relapses upon withdrawal? Got a brake, got an accelerator, right? Take away the brake. What do you got down? You got the accelerator down. And you got this extra dopaminergic activity. And he says, that's why we're getting such severe relapses. And so what we are perceiving as the return of the disease is in many ways a withdrawal effect. Okay? Then he said, okay, but what happens if we stay on these drugs long term? He says, well, look, we're getting tardive dyskinesia in many patients. What's tardive dyskinesia? That's a sign that the dopaminergic pathway to the basal ganglia is becoming dysfunctional. It's really losing its ability to control motor movement. And tardive dyskinesia knows when you see the tongue rhythmically moving around, and that seemed to happen at about 5% of patients per year. It was cumulative, 10, 15, 20%. So then what Chenard and Jones said is, well, if that's happening to the basal ganglia pathway, it may be happening to the pathway to the limbic system, which we believe is involved in psychosis. And if that's true, if that becomes dysfunctional, you could see actually what he called tardive psychosis setting in. And that's where people almost become permanently psychotic. In other words, the symptoms become more constant. And as he said, when that happens, the illness appears worse than ever before. New schizophrenia or original symptoms of greater severity will appear. He did research that seemed to show that tardive psychosis set in at the rate of about 3% a year. So after 5 years, you got 15, et cetera, et cetera. Now, and again, we're going to get to a place, I don't think that means the drugs have no place. I do, but it's something you want to worry about. Anyway, that worry comes up in the early 80s, and then it disappears. You won't find it in psychiatric textbooks. That concern is put aside, okay? And it's actually about this time we start saying, keep everybody on meds all the time. We really have social policy designed to do it. So real quickly, is there research since then that supports this vision that happened in the 70s, where selective use of drugs would be better, or not? We'll see if we can find what research since then shows. And it really comes of two types. There's MRI studies. The MRI studies, I will say, are very disturbing to me. Here's the MRI studies. The MRI studies, so they'll do this and they'll show that as people are put on antipsychotic medications, there will be morphological changes in the brain, and that are even dose-related. And they'll see that the basal ganglia swells a bit and the frontal lobe shrink a bit. They recognized this in the 90s, and then they ran a trial to say, they actually thought maybe this was good. This showed that the drug was acting on the brain, so they said, well, maybe as that happens, symptoms improve. So Rachel Gurr at the University of Pennsylvania ran a study to see if symptoms improve as this morphological changes happen over 3 years. And what they found is, rather than improve, that change was associated with a worsening of both positive and negative symptoms. There's been a second MRI study that's been done by Nancy Andreasen. Nancy Andreasen is the former editor, long-term editor of the American Journal of Psychiatry. She's been following a large group of first episode patients, doing MRIs, and her theory now is that schizophrenia is sort of a disease characterized by a progressive shrinkage of the brain. That's her sense of the disease process going on. And indeed, her studies show that that happens, and rather significantly, about 1% a year. Okay? But the problem is, as she noted, the more drug you're given, the more the shrinkage happens. So if anything, the drug is accelerating or exacerbating that problem. And then as the shrinkage happens, she says there's two other problems. You'll see cognitive decline associated with it, which becomes sort of noticeable after 5 years, and you'll see increasing negative symptoms. So again, we have this sense that the drugs really can be problematic long-term and sort of increasing chronicity. 3 real quick observational studies, and these are just studies where they look at patient populations, how they're doing 15 years later, 30 years later, et cetera. First one was done by Courtney Harding at Boston University. She followed a large group of patients released out of the back wards of Vermont State Hospital in the 50s and early 60s. She followed them up 20 years later, and in some ways the news was fantastic. 1/3 were completely recovered, asymptomatic, working, enjoying full lives. But as she said, everybody in that group had long since quit taking medication. Okay, that's the first one we have. A second one of this type was done by the World Health Organization. In the 1970s, they did a study that compared outcomes in developed countries of the world with those in 3 undeveloping countries. They were shocked to find that it was in the 3 poor countries of the world, India, Colombia, and Nigeria, that had much better 5-year outcomes. This stunned people. The WHO did a second study, a 2-year study with first episode patients. At the end of 2 years, again, there was a dramatic difference. They concluded, and listen to this, that living in a developed country is a strong predictor that you will not have full remission. And you really see that's a sort of a damning finding. Now, one of the hypotheses that the WHO investigators had said is, as they mounted the second study, was perhaps the people in the developed countries take their drugs more regularly. The developing countries take their drugs more regularly. They're more medication compliant. So they looked at medication usage, and what did they find? They found that in the poor countries of the world, only 16% were regularly maintained on drugs. Okay? And by the way, the best outcomes were in rural India, where even a smaller percentage. So at least association there was with lower medication use, once again. Finally, we have a study by Martin Harrell. He's at the University of Illinois. He's a psychologist who's been following 64 schizophrenia patients since the late 1970s and early 1980s. And what he does is, at a year, 2.5, 4.5, 7.5, 10, 15, he just follows up with the patients. Are they working? Are they asymptomatic? Have they been in the hospital in the past year? Are they on medication? Okay, or are they off medication? And what he found is at the end of 2 years, those off medication were doing slightly better than those on medication. At the end of 4.5 years, though, there was a divergence. Those off medication continued to improve, while those, did I just say that right? Those off medication continued to improve, while those on medication did not. Such that at the end of 4.5 years, 40% of those off medication were recovered, and more than 60% were working, whereas those on medication, only 6% were in recovery. So like an 8 times higher recovery rate. He followed them out for 15 years. That divergence in outcomes stayed for 15 years. At the end of 40 years, 40% were in recovery, off meds, and only 5% were in recovery on meds, 8 times higher recovery rate. That's the first thing. The second thing is those on meds were almost 3 times as likely to be suffering actively psychotic symptoms. It was something like 68% were having active symptoms, only 28% of those off meds. And the other thing with Martin Harrell is he actually has 3 groups. He has a recovered group, a so-so group, and a very poor group. In the off-med group, it was roughly 40% recovered, 44% in the so-so, only 16% in the bad group. In the on-med group, it was 6% or 5% recovered, and roughly 47% each in the okay and in the poor. In other words, you were much more likely to end up in the poor group as well. And here's what he said at his presentation in 2007 at the APA meeting. He told the psychiatrist there that, quote, I conclude that patients with schizophrenia not on antipsychotic medication for a long period of time have significantly better global functioning than those on antipsychotics. So, again, I mean, at the very least, this history tells us that maybe what we should be doing is using drugs selectively, right? In a much more cautious manner, because we do have this problem. And again, I think in these other things, some people, even in those studies in the 70s, clearly benefited. And wouldn't it be great if somewhere, someplace, somebody had tried that? And what sort of outcomes would they have? And the wonderful thing is, someone has. And someone's been doing it that way for 20 years in northern Finland and in western Lapland. So they took this ever since 1992. They take their first episode patients and they do not put them on antipsychotics immediately. They want to see if the psychosis can abate. All right? And then if that doesn't, they put them on. They'll keep them on for a period of time. And then they make a decision whether or not the person will benefit from staying on them long term. Here's their 5-year results. And by the way, they've been doing this study. They're the best studied population anywhere. Their last study, at the end of 5 years with their first episode patients, 84% were either working or back in school. Only 16% on disability. That's number one. Number two, of that 84% group that's in the employment center, they have a lower unemployment rate than the Finnish population as a whole. That's how regularly they're working. In terms of medication use, only 1/3 have ever been exposed to antipsychotics. Oh, by the way, they do use sleeping pills early on to help restore sleep-wake cycles. Okay? And again, it's not placebo. There's some intensive psychosocial support right from the beginning. 1/3 have been exposed, only 20% regularly maintained on antipsychotics. Okay? It shows what's possible. It's really an optimistic story. One other thing that's happened since they adopted this thing, number one, is they now have the this is the only district in Finland that do it. They now have the lowest per capita spending of any health district in Finland on psychiatric disorders. That's number one. And number two, schizophrenia is now disappearing from that region of Finland. And here's why. Prior to this time, they had one of the highest incidences of schizophrenia in all of Finland, and actually in all of Europe. Had something like 25 new cases per year. But what's happening now, since they're getting these first episode psychotic patients, and since their psychosis is breaking so regularly, they're not staying psychotic for 6 months, so they're never moving on to the schizophrenia diagnosis. They're now down to about 2 cases per year, from 25 new cases down to 2. So all I was saying to that story is a consistent story of a better way to use medications. Okay? It's not an anti-medication story. It's a best use of medication story. And so you can see, and really the thing is this. What you're seeing in this story, it's consistent. At the very least is many people can descend into a psychotic break and ascend out of it. And if they can ascend out of it with proper care and actually not end up on medications, they really have a chance to basically return to a normal life and not sort of a career as a mental patient. It's an escape valve. And you can see in this an example of a solution that maybe we should have a pilot project that we should try. Real quickly on the other disorders, and I know I got to run this up so we can have questions. If you look at what's happened to depression, if you go back to the epidemiological studies prior to the introduction of antidepressants, they say you're going to get better. You have every expectation. It may take 6 months, it may take 8 months, but this depressive bout, you can be pretty sure will lift. And they would actually, when they thought about using antidepressants, the idea was to accelerate that recovery, to make it happen faster. Well, what did they find? They found that often the antidepressants did help it lift faster. But right away, doctors at the time who were used to treating patients without drugs start making observations. Yeah, but now my patients are relapsing more frequently. Are we turning this into a more chronic disorder? It's the same thing sort of you see with the antipsychotics, this worry. Real quickly, this sense that this course of depression is changing becomes more and more of an acknowledgement to a much more chronic course as opposed to an episodic course. So the old epidemiological studies would say, you have a bout of depression, it would clear, and maybe you have another one 2, 3 years later, or 5 years later, etc. But it was more like the flu that visited occasionally, all right? Anyway, by 1992, a guy by the name Giovanni Fava in Italy said, listen, we've got to confront this. And he says, Antidepressant drugs in depression might be beneficial in the short term, but worsen the progression of the disease in the long term by increasing the biochemical vulnerability to depression. Use of antidepressant drugs may propel the illness to a more malignant and treatment-unresponsive course. A very famous guy in the field named Ross Baldessarini, he's sort of one of the fathers of psychopharmacology, said, yes, we need to confront this. This is what the data is showing. And here was the response from Donald Klein from Columbia. He said, the industry is not interested in this question, the NIMH is not interested, and the FDA is not interested. Nobody is interested. Stop talking about it. And in fact, they did. The way psychiatry handled this shift in outcomes to a much more chronic course is they said, and you can read this in the textbooks, these old epidemiological studies must have been flawed. Okay, and they say, for example, the 1999 edition of the APA's textbook of psychiatry, it says, it used to be believed that most patients would eventually recover from a major depressive episode. However, more extensive studies have disproved this assumption. So that's how you can see that the modern course of depression is much more chronic than it used to be, much less episodic, and what they say is those old studies must have been flawed. You can also look at, in the book, you'll look at observational studies today where you look at people long-term that go on drug and don't go on drug. Now, these can be problematic because maybe those that don't go on drug really aren't as sick at the beginning. Maybe they have an inner resilience better, et cetera, et cetera. So you have that caveat. But every single study I could find was that the unmedicated patients long-term were less likely to be depressed and had less disability. And when the NIMH looked at the study, this question, it was a 6-year study in the 90s, early 2000s, going on, those treated had 3 times the risk, they were 3 times more likely to suffer a cessation of their role function and 7 times more likely to become disabled, those who got treatment. Okay? And again, there's sort of this consistency here that you see, short-term efficacy, but maybe long-term chronicity. We see that in the long-term course. The other big thing, if you want to look at what is causing the disability rolls to skyrocket, it is really bipolar patients. And the bipolar story has 2 things. You've got to look at why are we having so many more bipolar patients. It used to be like 1 in 5,000. Now it's 1 in 40. And there's 2 things happening there. One, of course, is expanded diagnostics. All right, there's no question about that. But the other, in fact, is exposure to drugs prior to the bipolar diagnosis. Partly it's illicit drugs, marijuana, LSD, cocaine, etc. You'll see that in about 1/3 of patients. But also it is antidepressants and stimulants. They dramatically increase the risk that a unipolar patient will convert to bipolar. There was one survey of people in the DBSA, that's the support group for people with mood disorders, affective disorders. They found that 60% had had their first manic episode after going on an antidepressant. So this is the other thing that's really happening in terms of why we're getting this increase in bipolar. And if we would just be alert to that, you can see that maybe we would treat those patients different. Maybe they don't really have bipolar, but they've had this bad reaction. Now, the other thing you have to look at that is absolutely remarkable is the deterioration in bipolar outcomes in modern times. I was actually at the, you'll read in the book, I was at the APA meeting 2008, and basically there was a meeting on, oh my God, our outcomes are just getting worse and worse, especially as we embrace these drug cocktails. Just real quickly, it used to be episodic. You'd have your bout. Then you'd recover to what's called euthymia, meaning asymptomatic. You were fine during that time. 85% went back to their usual functioning. There was no long-term cognitive decline. Yes, you might have a second bout 3 years later, etc. And some people wouldn't, but some people would have these periodic bouts. It's like the flu again that kept visiting. Today, people have many more sort of bouts. Second, they do not recover to euthymia like they used to. A lot of them have this sort of low-grade depression constantly. Employment rates and we also see something now called ultracyclers, rapid cyclers, where they're switching polarity several times a year, sometimes even several times a month. That was never seen before antidepressants. At that meeting, they said, oh, that's being caused by the antidepressants. Employment rates have gone from 85% to 35%. Okay, a remarkable decline in employment. The other problem that's really tragic is people on the cocktails are now showing signs of cognitive decline. especially after 5 years. And if you actually read the long-term outcomes literature, bipolar outcomes are now starting to merge with schizophrenia outcomes. And historically, these always used to be different. It was the schizophrenia was the chronic and the sort of the deterioration. Bipolar was a good outcome story. They are now merging. And the other thing that's happening with bipolar patients, you're seeing a lot of physical problems, obviously related to the drugs, early death, etc. And here's how Ross Baldessarini summed up this change in outcomes. He says, again, he's father of psychopharmacology, prognosis for bipolar disorder was once considered relatively favorable, but contemporary findings suggest that disability and poor outcomes are prevalent despite major therapeutic advances. So sort of the irony there. So where does this leave us? I'm not going to go into the children's study, but really if you see what I think when you go through this literature time and time again is you see short-term efficacy, but actually increased long-term chronicity across the board. And that's really problematic. Now, you haven't heard of any of this research. One of the things I do in the book, you didn't hear of the Martin Harrow study, right? Did any of you read about the Martin Harrow study? Nobody. Never appeared in an American newspaper. First time it appeared in an American newspaper was after I gave a talk at Worcester. Why wasn't it put in American newspapers? Well, the NIMH, which funded it, didn't issue a press release. The APA didn't issue a press release. No one issued a press release. Now, imagine the results are different. Imagine if 40% of those on meds are recovered versus 5% off meds. Do you think we would have read headlines? Of course we would have. And one of my pleas with this book is simply this. We have evidence that the drugs can be useful. I agree with that. We have plenty of individuals who stabilize well, are living very productive lives on medications, and God bless that's true. And fantastic. Make that happen. You know, that's a good use. But as we come up with a evidence-based use of medications, a best use, you've got to incorporate the long-term outcomes data. You've got to have a public discussion that, bipolar patients did have cognitive decline. Today they do. They used to be 85%. Now it's 35%. They're much more symptomatic. You have to have that as part of our public discussion. Same thing with schizophrenia. You have to have the Harrow study as part of the discussion, right? If depression is running a more chronic course, have that part of the discussion. If you look at the one study that was done for ADHD, okay, long-term study done by the NIMH, big announcement. After 14 months, the drug-treated kids were doing a little bit better than the behavioral therapy. Big announcement. See, the drugs work. At the end of 3 years, you know what they found? Being on medication was a marker of deterioration, even on the core symptoms. All right? Those kids were also more like the drug-treated kids were more likely to be depressed, anxious. There was some short curbing of growth, and they were more likely to be delinquent. They followed that 6 years. Researchers concluded we found no benefit, none, zero, in the medication group. Everything's in the risk side there. That wasn't announced. And the other problem, if we look at why we're having so many kids ending up on disability, roughly about 25% of kids on ADHD kids put on stimulants, kept on them, will eventually convert to bipolar. So you really have a pathway where you can take, a hyperactive kid, and next thing you know, you got a lifelong mental patient. So here's my plea to you all tonight. I really hope, and again, this is not a medical advice book. Anybody on meds and they're working for you, fantastic. I think that's great. And all I'm saying here is, and I really believe meds have a place. And all we got to do, look at that Finnish study as a beautiful example of a place. It's where instead of the medications become the central focus, they're moved off sort of in this other, like a crutch or whatever, or a thoughtful use, a best use. And they get much better outcomes. That is not an anti-med thing. That is a pro-med thing. That's a pro-best use thing. So my appeal to you tonight, and why I really wrote this book in a way, and what I hope out of it is, I think we need a national discussion that incorporates this long-term data, right? That looks at the fact that bipolar outcomes are deteriorating, the course of depression is deteriorating, and that when we look about psychotic patients, it's clear some people will do better off. we need to make this information known, and we need to have a conversation about it. So my plea to you, those of you who have the book, is read the book, struggle through that boring science, and see if you believe, like I do, that we need to change our paradigm of care. So what I really honestly believe, this quote, psychopharmacological revolution began in 1955. It's 55 years later, and I honestly think it's a failed revolution. And by that I mean is we're having these rising disability rates. People are dying now 20 to 25 years later. We get all sorts of physical problems. Employment rates are down. It's just not a sign of a form of care that is really helping people who enter into this disturbed state regain their full lives, where they're working and they sort of, what I think we really want is someone, as much as possible, someone descends into psychosis or a bad break. And this is, by the way, what they do in northern Finland. The sense is, this isn't going to be you the rest of life. You've had a bad tumble, but we're going to help you get back your full life. And I think that's sort of the sort of goal we should set for ourselves. And my belief is that if everybody in this room sort of struggles with this literature, struggles with this evidence base, that maybe you'll end up like me and thinking that we need change and that we need to have really a full-body discussion of this literature. And if you do, just as a possibility is, let's say Mr. Cole would like to set up a house for newly diagnosed patients in which he's going to adopt this sort of selective use model. Well, if we as a group, a society, know this literature, and we know what happened in the 1970s, and we know what happened in Finland, and we know Martin Harrells, well, maybe he can go to the legislature or whoever the funding agency and says, well, that would be a great idea, because if you can get kids and not put them on SSI and SSDI and get them back to school, that'll save us at least a lot of money up down the way. So I'm going to end it there. Last message is, I hope this did not come off as anti-med at all, or I hope it did not come off as any sort of advice for anybody to stop taking medication. It really is, can we develop a paradigm of care that's consistent with 55 years of evidence? And I believe if it is, you've got to shift your thinking about the medications. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I guess I'm left with a question about, you've shown, and many studies, they're all a little different, but there's success, as you say, in each side for those that are using meds, those who are not, and there are failures.
True.
But the part I'm having trouble with is, so is the use of medication the only factor that is observed and studied? Or, to put it in a different way, what are the factors that determine whether or not there are differences in those that are using meds versus those who are not? Is it about the other forms of treatment? Is it about the level and nature of the psychological counseling? I mean, there's something else, and usually when you look at why are there differences, you look at a series of factors and perhaps run multiple regressions. So I'm concerned that we're looking as if, you made some remarks at the beginning about how some people enter into a facility, they're given, a little bit of looking, a lot of medicine, and they're sent away in once a month. Is that the actual experience of everyone on drugs, or is there something about the other services that make the difference, and it's not necessarily drugs versus not drugs, it's something else?
Right. That's a great question. And I think there's, first of all, it's not that there's a clear answer to that in the research literature. It's maybe something that should be studied some. I think there's a two-pronged answer to that. There was one study done in the 1970s that looked at who was doing well with a schizophrenia diagnosis. Now, this particular study said the overriding factor actually had to do with community, their involvement in the community. So that if you had people on meds with a lot of involvement in the community, they did pretty well. If they didn't do well. Conversely, people off the meds if they had community support. So they found that community support was really or community involvement, community engagement was the determining factor. I'm a big believer that human beings need to be part of communities, and it's good to work, it's good to have friends, and that anybody who doesn't have that starts to falter. And the first thing you need to do is sort of build that back up if some people have lost their community. So I'm a big thing in that. It's not real clear in the research what you're asking, though, here, and whether they've identified these different factors. I will say this, though, and this is part of the conversation we need to have. I honestly do think if you look at this, what happens to the brain is pretty problematic on the medications because, in fact, they do perturb something. The brain tries to compensate for that. And in this new functioning where you have accelerator and brain and breakdown at the same time, it does become real problematic to get off, okay, because you've got this new balance. And there is some real sign, and you're seeing it in the cognitive decline that shows up long time, that these systems start to become dysfunctional over time. Even on just SSRIs, you are seeing some memory problems crop up in people. So I think we need more research about that. We need more, sort of addressing that directly. And really the question is, I think, and we have had this shift in the long-term outcomes, are the drugs on the whole, actually sort of an iatrogenic agent that increases the chronicity of the disorder. Now, that's for the psychiatric symptoms. You do see some of the iatrogenic effects in terms of the physical effects, right? Because we do know that people on these medications often have a lot of physical problems. That shows an iatrogenic effect. The early death is we've got that problem. The cognitive decline sort of is associated with iatrogenic effects. So, but now let me defend, okay? Maybe part of the problem is the dosages that we're using and the fact we're using a lot of drugs. So maybe if you sort of rethink drugs and you try to use them in smaller amounts, lower doses, you don't get these problems. And now, next thing you knew, you have a system that provides community care, and you find some people do really well on the meds. Low dose, fantastic. They really are a helpful aid. So I don't know how much the iatrogenic comes from the polypharmacy and the high doses. That's a big question, and I don't know. But and I love this question. These are the things we have to ask. And I don't have the answers, but you can see why we need to ask them. Yeah, it's the limitations of the study. And all I can say to you is, you guys are focused on community access. If there's anything that I'm quite sure is helpful, it's community support, jobs, friends, housing, and very helpful. And again, I think that overrides so much else. Peter. And then, yeah.
First of all, I want to thank you for your courageous work, not just this book, but the other book, which truly sparked a major revolution, unlike what happened in 1955. But what did happen in 1955 was actually the first time that an industry discovered how to make money off of psychiatric patients. And, just like the car industry figured out that we like to drive cars, over the last 100 years, more and more cars were sold. Same thing with psychopharmacological manufacturers, and they had psychiatrists as salespeople. Now, you have a problematic situation here. If your book and many other studies suggest that what we really need to do is put way fewer people on these medications for starters, use way lower dosages, and use them in targeted ways, and use fewer agents together, you're basically going to take away 80 to 90% of the pharmaceutical industry's business. Now, how are you going to do that?
First of all, I think Peter just outlined where you could go in terms of the best use of meds. Did you hear that? I mean, it absolutely was. There's a place for them, okay? and that was the best use. But how do we do that? Because you're right. All of a sudden, you've cut 80 to 90% of their profits. And the storytelling machinery in this society of ours is dominated in this way. It's not just that the pharmaceutical companies have a lot of influence. They basically have bought academic psychiatry, and academic psychiatrists now are their salesmen, as Peter said. And academic psychiatrists have a lot of cachet in our society. They're the experts. They're who we come to believe. And if academic psychiatry is going to hide Martin Harrow's study, he was told not to publish by his peers, by the way, because it would be harmful. How are we going to, as Peter says, how are we going to fight this? And I'll give you an example of what happens when you publish a book like I just did. The first review came out in the UK, and it was a very nice review. It was by a guy who writes on the history of medicine, writes about evidence medicine. He's a physician, and he basically said, wow, the evidence is pretty strong. We need to be rethinking this. Okay? The first review that appeared in the Boston Globe, I'm pretty sure it was not an assigned review. The person who is a sleep specialist, pediatric sleep specialist at Children's Hospital, all of a sudden a review came out that just hammered me, misrepresented the book actually, and concluded by comparing me to a South African despot who denied that HIV caused AIDS and therefore led to the premature death of 300,000 people. So suddenly I woke up last Wednesday, I'm having my coffee and I'm being compared to an AIDS denier. Not a good morning. So Peter, I don't know, the problem is you get hammered when you present this information. You get isolated. I'm sure you've experienced this. And my plea to you is, my only hope is that, and really you want to know the truth, I was hoping this night would be a seed for a beginning, is that people who are involved in the service of, of care, who care for you love these human beings, and you want to do well by them, this is your life work, that you will fight to make this information known to yourself, struggle with this information, see if you see it the same as I do, and then you'll fight to make it known to your legislatures. You'll tell other people in the field. And the only thing I see happening is that somehow there has to be a grassroots desire for information based on the value is that we believe in honesty in medicine, that sort of thing. Will it come from psychiatry? Not a chance. Will psychiatry do everything to discredit you, to isolate you, to keep this information unknown? Absolutely. It's hard going this intellectual path. I mean, I can personally attest to it. It's not pleasant because you end out of sync with so many people, even your friends, workers, and they think that somehow you don't want things well for people who struggle with their minds. Well, you do. You just want things better. But the answer to Peter is information. The truth shall set us free, basically.
I have a question that's related to Dr. Stastny's question, actually, and it's sneaky. It's two very interrelated questions, then. In that case, then, towards the end of your book, you outline several different ways, including the study, the methods in Finland, a couple of other people, as well as some possible future directions for research regarding the causes of psychiatric disorders. I was wondering whether you could envision anything else that we could be doing to change the paradigm, as you put it. And related to that, what then happens to all of the currently practicing psychiatrists who have been trained in this sort of pharmacological model of treatment, who presumably, I'm just guessing here, would probably need some other sort of training if we were to implement a less chemically based form of treatment?
Right. Two questions. So what can you do to sort of help change the paradigm? Well, there's something very specific and then something actually addressing what you spoke about. I honestly think you could get behind a project, a pilot project, for first episode patients and really study it. Make it a research project. See what happens to those kids. And even if it's not randomized, just see what happens to them 2 years out. Can you get them back to school, etc.? So that's number one, what you can do. You can sort of document a paradigm that might work better. The other thing, actually, I think that would be really nice, and this goes to your question, is somehow if you can document the effectiveness of community care, okay, about getting people back to work. How important, and we were even talking about things like dogs today. I happen to be a big believer in the therapeutic effects of dogs and pets. People love their dogs and pets. I'd like to see a study as how effective is having a dog in your life. And my guess is pretty effective, if you like animals. But my point is this, we all know here, everybody in this room knows that having good shelter, friends, we were hearing about a book program, the chance to tell your story. Imagine how great it is. You tell your story, it's bound, and it's sold at the St. Mark's bookstore, right? On 8th Street between 2nd and 3rd, if I remember. Think how great that is. You go into the bookstore, and there's your story. Fantastic. And somehow what I'd like to have, because the research is all focused on meds. And you immediately said to me, well, what about this other stuff? It's missing. We've gone so much, we've missed this sort of really, and we'll have a little bit on psychotherapy, that sort of thing. But what's missing is really community care. How effective is community care? And I believe it is very effective. So did that answer your question? It's like, that's the second thing is, and here's the thing with psychiatry. Real quickly on this, why did psychiatry go down this route? I mean, I can't imagine it's really very fun just prescribing drugs all the time. I mean, actually being a psychiatrist, it seems like would be a great job if you could really get to know people and all. In the 1970s, psychiatry was failing. Drug sales were dropping. Psychiatrists felt that they were having all this competition from these other therapists, social workers, psychologists, and they really retreated into this medical model as a way to protect the sort of financial privileges in society, to protect the prescribing powers. So how are you going to switch psychiatry back? I don't know. I don't really know. I really don't know that answer. I mean, they're so like this. I mean, they're so convinced that this is the way, and their drugs fix, biological problems. It's a belief system. Yes.
It's interesting because just to it's not really a question, but just to add, it's a comment to add to what you're saying. I use a study. I provide care management services to psychiatric clients, and I use a study to demonstrate a clinical outcome study to demonstrate the effectiveness of care management for psychiatric clients. So there's one study that has geriatric depression clients and outcomes. The entire group is on medication. The care managed group does much better.
Right.
So, addressing let's have a study. There are some glimmers around that support your premise that yes, medication has a place, but maybe it's other modalities that are doing more good.
And this, again, this is why we need to have a discussion. You can already hear it happening. We need the studies to say, listen, care management is good. These things have a really profound effect on terms of outcomes, etc. And if we can have that knowledge, that there's a value out there in medicine that it should be evidence-based. Okay? That's an accepted value. So if you can come forth with that study, okay, we enter that, and then we sort of embrace that modality. And it's just, we need that. We really need it.
I'm actually curious about the town in Finland and the decrease in the case of psychotic episodes. And, I was wondering two things. A, just what is it that they think, what are the variables that they think have influenced this and have helped create this?
Right.
And the other is, have you reviewed the statistical data to see the validity of it?
You mean I've reviewed the published data? It's not like I have access to the raw data. Okay? So obviously I don't. Here's what I went to Finland. I spent some time in Finland. And by the way, this actually arose out of a national Finnish study. Okay, if you really trace the roots of where it starts in 1969, and there's all sorts of research that leads up to it, and Tornio adopts this after a national Finnish study where they're not even doing the gather. You know, it's a nationwide study, and what happens is they're one of 3 experimental sites where they're going to use drugs in this way, and they really embraced this idea of not putting people on meds. And so they had the most experience of any of the 3 experimental sites in sort of seeing patients over longer term. So, but if you're asking me, it's the best studied group. You know, they've been doing 5-year studies ever since '92. They have other Scandinavian groups coming to them now. I think it's a little hard to lie about disability numbers, employment numbers. That's an easy thing. In terms of health expenditures, again, it's a national health insurance service. So I think that's really pretty solid. Here's the difference. So what if you go to Finland? There's a couple things. Whether it's right or wrong, I'm just going to tell you how they conceive of psychosis. They do not say to the person, psychosis resides in your head. Okay? They say psychosis arises from the in-between spaces. Okay? It's a community thing. Okay? And that the person who is psychotic bears the burden of making manifest this disruption in the social fabric. Okay? So there's no blame, there's no stigma placed on that person. If anything, the person is a little bit celebrated for letting everybody know we have this problem in our society. Okay? Now, when you conceive of psychosis in that way, you can see the hope of repairing it, because if you repair the fabric, the psychosis is going to go away. Now, so how do they respond? Well, they try to keep it out of the hospital, but at the very first day, so they'll get a call for help or whatever, my son's psychotic or whatever, and they'll come to the house. And it's always a team. It's 2, 3 people, okay? And they will just basically now start talking. And they will say to the person, tell us your story. Whatever you want to say, tell us your story. And if the person's agitated, doesn't want to be there, or whatever, they won't force that. They'll say, well, okay, go to your room, but could you leave your door open? Maybe you can at least hear what... They'll ask everybody, family, friends in, you know, what's going on? Everyone tells their story. So there's this sort of group narration. And I don't know about you, but group narration I always enjoy. It's like this shared conversation. Now, the other bit that's really sort of interesting, the therapist will never plan anything outside the meeting. All decisions happen inside the meeting. So there's no sense that they're going to talk about this person. There's a sense of shared empowerment right from the beginning, okay? And the other thing that's sort of novel about it is, let's say you and I are therapists, and this person's talking. At some point, we turn to each other and, quote, we make our thoughts known. Okay, and we just say, well, here's what I'm thinking, she tells me what she's thinking. And I think this creates some degree of intimacy. Because when I sat in and I asked the people what they like, they said, we really like it when they make their thoughts known. It's like they're eavesdropping on the people. And, you know, I almost put this in the book, but then I chickened out. Here was my sense of why this works. You know how chimpanzees, if they have fights or stuff, they'll end up picking nits from each other? There'll be this sort of communal nitpicking. I thought it was a communal nitpicking exercise is basically what was going on there. Bringing this person who somehow has become separated from society and they're welcoming him back into society. Okay? That's what it really seemed like was going on to me. It was that sort of community. And as they go forward, they will meet like the second day, the third day. Why do they have such good return to work things? At some point, employers come to the meetings. And they start talking about, well, what sort of job, et cetera, et cetera. School teachers, admissions counselors come to the meetings, et cetera. It's a community response. It's like, we're going to welcome back in. We're going to repair this social fabric. And it, you know, they said, they don't have any really sort of elaborate thing. It says, we've been doing it for 20 years. It works. People are getting better. You know, we don't really know. But that's their conception. And by the way, families like this so much because you can see one of the things that's happening is they're calling for help right away. because there's no forced medication, there's no hospitalization, there's no coercion, there's no sense of oppression. People are very comfortable with it. And they keep really dropping the time of people who are actively psychotic. They're down to about 3 weeks now from the time that anyone can identify first psychotic symptoms to first meeting. And that's clearly part of the benefit. So that's what I think is happening. I think it's the selective drug use is important, but really they have a way to make that person invited back into the community right away and valued. There's no shame. Why should there be shame? And your story is considered, they don't tell you not to stop having psychotic thoughts. They'll just say, tell us your story. It's fine. Great. Cool. Right. As they say, they're just telling stories we like to listen. That's what they'll say.
I was going to just comment on Cindy, or Cynthia to go with Cindy, in support of what she was saying about this issue of, I forget exactly how you put it, but that the third world countries, the developing countries, that is one example, and there are statistics for that. I mean, you say that in your book. Those are not fabricated numbers. These are developing countries where schizophrenics have a much better outcome. And at first, if I remember correctly in his book, I don't know if you read it, but they assumed that this because it was a drug thing, and then they found out that they weren't on drugs.
Right.
And the better outcome was back to this point, what you're calling community, which I say is, my belief, it's community, but it's also, it's human contact. It's interpersonal connections. And the drugs can be in a crisis. They can fill that void when you're terrorized and panicked because you're losing your mind or whatever. But I think the drugs have that place. But I think it's also possible too that community or people, and I think 12-step programs in this country and throughout the world, they kind of mimic that to some degree, that people can go, whether it's whatever it is, if it's alcohol, and in your book you talk about some groups that it's a 12-step, it's a support, and I think that so many times, that particularly these first-time episodes of mental illness, that if you have that what's the word I want?
Interpersonal, right?
Yeah, but if you have that, when someone acts, when they get in there, intervention, when you have that intervention of that, and like these crisis places where you could go, and they talk about, you go and there's beds if you're having a psychotic break initially, and there are people there who are with you, and again, the whole peer thing with the community access is so much and supportive is also, I think, very important, because to have someone who cares and who has been there and you can see that has survived and has made it to the other side is
inspiring. And just one quick thing here is, this is one of the problems with the chemical imbalance story, is it makes it, that's the focus of everything, that becomes the first thing. If we had this sense that, okay, drugs can be useful at times, that we said, what do people really need? They need this. Then we could focus on this. And it's really, all of us know this. We all need to be with people. Human beings are very social creatures. We need to be people. I think we need to love people. We need to be loved. We need to have friends. And shouldn't someone in distress, isn't that what they need as well? So if we could have this conversation, maybe we could change it back to these sort of thoughts. And I got to get out. Thank you very much. Thank you.
For more information on the author, go to robertwhitaker.org.
Up next, from Book TV's coverage of the